Hello and welcome to the third video in the Discipleship video series here at Heritage Alliance. Thank you for coming to check it out. So in the last video we looked at how God called Abraham out of the nations and promised to make a nation out of him. In this video we're going to find out what happens to that nation. So for a quick recap, Abraham has Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. The family moves down to Egypt from Canaan due to a famine in Canaan, and in Egypt they are very prosperous and they grow rapidly. So much so, in fact, that eventually they draw the attention of the governing bodies in Egypt. These governing bodies decide that this small nation, now known as Israel, is a threat to them and that they need to do something about it. So what they do is they come up with policies that make the labor very hard for the Israelites. But when this doesn't work, they resort to infanticide and start to kill off all the little boys of Israel. Through this time, God preserves one little boy, and he grows up to be the one God chooses to deliver Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And that person, of course, is Moses. God plans on leading the Israelites back to the Promised Land, the land where Abraham had lived all those years ago. But before he can do that, he makes a covenant with them. A covenant that guarantees that he will be their God and they shall be his people. For our first passage today, we will look at a short scene in the book of Exodus where God lays out the terms of the covenant and the people of Israel agree to these terms. And just as always, when the chapter and verses appear on the screen, you can pause it, read the chapters and verses, and then press play. After you press play, the questions will come up on the screen. You can pause it again and go through the questions. Okay, so here we can see that the nation of Israel did agree to God's terms. And those terms are spelled out throughout the rest of the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. After Deuteronomy comes the books of Joshua and Judges, where we read how the nation entered the land of Canaan, drove out the inhabitants there, and then became quite poor at following these terms and regulations that God laid out for them in the covenant. Eventually they ask for a king to be like the nations around them, and God concedes. So God gives them first Saul, then David, then Solomon, and after Solomon the nation splits in two into northern and southern halves. The northern kingdom never follows God the way he commanded them to, so they very quickly end up going into exile at the hands of the Assyrians, and they never returned. The southern kingdom has some good kings, and their time as a kingdom is extended a bit longer, but eventually they too go into exile at the hands of the Babylonians. They are there for a number of years, and then eventually some are allowed to return to the land of Israel and rebuild it as they once knew. Let's take a look in the Bible at the passages that speak of how the northern and southern kingdoms went into exile. Okay, so those passages are quite difficult because they describe in detail the horrible things that happened to the nations of Israel and Judah. And you can wonder why God would allow things like this to happen to a nation that he said was his own and that he would protect them. To understand this better, I really encourage you to read and reread and become familiar with the story of the nation as a whole from beginning to end throughout the books of Exodus all the way through to the end of Kings, to give you a better understanding of just how this dynamic between a nation and its God played out. These stories are the context within which so much of the rest of the Old Testament is set, whether it be what the psalmists are talking about or what the prophets are talking about. You will understand this better if you know what is happening in those hundreds of years that the nations existed. And furthermore, these are the stories that Jesus and his disciples would have grown up with. These are the stories that they would identify with and where they would find their sense of place in the world and in history. So I greatly encourage you to become familiar with the story of the nations of Israel and Judah. So that is my encouragement to you today. And until next time, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.